Greetings and salutations. You're listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CDH. I'm your host, Reed, aka Sick Robot, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going, everyone?
And in this episode, we're going to be covering a topic that we've sort of danced around a bit over the past, 2 or 3 years of podcasting, but haven't really covered comprehensively, and that's going to be building interaction suites in your decks. Big topic, but we're going to try to break it down into some reasonably bite-sized chunks for easy listening. I would say, what have we been up to since last episode, but I think the answer from both of us is not much. Just living life, I guess. So we would also hop into housekeeping, although we don't really have much to say for housekeeping either. We don't have any new patrons for this episode, but again, I will say, if you would like to become a patron, you're happy to do so, and or we would be happy for you to do so, and there's a link to do such in the description for the episode. Helps keep the lights on for the show, helps keep us, doing stuff like working toward getting the gameplay episodes out, etc., etc., so that'd be much appreciated, but we will just say thanks here to all of our existing patrons. You guys rock.
You sure do.
Not
most
much
of you, at least.
Yeah, just I'll say a heavy majority.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of new developments, also not much to say here. We're sort of speedrunning the intro to this episode. This might be the fastest intro before the main topic that we've ever done, honestly.
Yeah, but think about how fast it could have been if we'd actually just skipped them.
Just skipped all of it. I mean, I don't want to disorient our listeners too much. Come on, you gotta give them at least a sense of structure. You can't just hop right into the main topic. Although, that is
we
what
are
I'm going to do.
professionals, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That is what I'm going to do immediately, though, which is, we're going to get into our main topic, right now. So we're just going to be sort of going through, some general, high-level, concepts behind, how you build interaction suites in CDH. And by interaction, we mean, primarily, stuff like instant speed interaction, so counter magic, removal, I mean, obviously some sorcery speed removal as well, things that potentially interact with maybe graveyards, other weird stuff in the stacks, stuff like stifles, just anything for the most part that tends to be put onto the stack in an instantaneous manner that interacts with other permanents or other game objects. So yeah, I think the way that I at least want to start this, and I think it makes sense to start talking about interaction packages, is sort of realistically, starting from not the cards that you want to play in your interaction package, or even necessarily the specific effects that you want in your interaction packages, but really what you actually want to put interaction in your deck to achieve, and what you want out of it. I think we've had this, or we've sort of talked about this a bit before, and I've gone over some terminology that I like to use just to be relatively clear on what I mean when I'm talking about different pieces of interaction. So just to reintroduce that to our audience, I think we're going to be using these a lot in this episode, which is the terminology of protective and disruptive interaction. Protective interaction being stuff like counter magic that's stopping opponents from interacting with your win attempts, or removal potentially to, I would even call this removal to remove Stax pieces that are stopping you from going off. Whereas disruptive interaction is more about interacting with other people's game plans, stopping other people from either winning or sticking maybe pieces that would put them very far ahead in the game that you don't necessarily want them to have for a protracted period of time. Just sort of interacting with other people's permanents and spells in the stack that would be heavily proactive for opponents, so countering it ad nauseum would be disruptive.
Yeah. I think it's really about, are you protecting your game plan or disrupting their game plan is, because I know a lot of people have used terms offensive and defensive,
yeah.
And it's wait, is offensive counter magic counter magic for when you're on the offense, or is it that you're using against other people. Anyways,
or is it just really profane counter magic that you don't really want to read the names of the cards for?
like, I mean, arcane denial is pretty offensive, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so honestly, like I would say like primarily, if I were to do like the highest level categorization of interaction suites in various decks, I think probably the highest level differentiation you could get to is like, is this interaction suite protective or disruptive? A lot of the time, like, you're obviously there are going to be elements of both, and like actual factual counterspell could be both disruptive and protective depending on how you use it. But there are a lot of effects that are better in one use case than another, and a lot of interaction suites will either lean toward one or lean toward the other. So a protective counter magic suite or protective interaction suite might be potentially a lot lower on removal. Potentially, you're not looking to really like remove people's permanents that they've already resolved. You're just sort of trying to stop them from pointing counter magic at your stuff. So maybe you're like very low on removal, and you're instead much higher on stuff like Flusterstorm or Dispel or Mental Misstep, or things that like would primarily be looking at stopping opponents from interacting with you. Also things like, Silence and Veil of Summer are probably like the most widely played, like almost strictly protective interaction.
I mean,
I
don't know that Silence is strictly
sure,
but certainly veils tend to be very protective.
Yeah. And if you want to build a protective interaction suite, a lot of the time you're going to be looking at it's going to end up looking like a lot of stuff that targets instants on the stack, and typically costs a relatively low amount of mana, because you tend to be mana limited when you're trying to both resolve spells and protect them. So these will tend to look like very, like, protective interaction suites will tend to look very low to the ground and very focused on stack interaction specifically and interacting with the other instants.
It'll also tend to involve effects that are like much more, or like often it'll involve effects that are like narrowly tailored to exactly what you're trying to protect from. I think a good example of this is cards like Pyro and Red Blast, where their best use by far is stopping other people's counterspells.
Yep.
They don't actually hit very many win cons. Or another thing is, like, you might be trading when it comes to removal and less counterspells. You're probably going to be trading the permanency of the effect or card advantage for mana efficiency. So like a card like a March of Swirling Mists, where you can use it pretty cheaply to just like phase it all the Stax effects, make your attempt, is something that tends to be more protective, whereas, things that actually like kill the Stax pieces permanently and don't give you card disadvantage would fit more into a disruptive suite.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I think like in the I'd say the probably like the prime differentiator here would be like Chain of Vapor versus Swords to Plowshares. Or like a very easy dichotomy there of like Chain of Vapor being very much like a like not permanent, very temporary solution to problems, but a very powerful solution to those problems in terms of it can be proactive and also like can get stuff off the board very cheaply. Whereas Swords to Plowshares is more is a bit like more narrow, but like a lot more permanent and a lot more about getting rid of a creature and like having it be gone for multiple turns later. Basically exactly what Morgan just said. And then on the other side, obviously disruptive interaction suites, which are becoming sort of rarer and rarer by the year, by the day. I don't know. They're just pretty rare right now. It's rare that a deck will want to be on the disruptive side of interaction right now. Obviously, you'll see a lot of these types of suites in decks like mono blue, like blue white will typically have more disruptive interaction suites. A lot of like low color blue decks, just in general, and like cards like this are typically they're typically going to be or end up being wider reaching and sort of more broadly applicable to a lot of situations, thinking something like dispel versus like actual factual counterspell here, where if you're in a disruptive role, a lot of the time you want to prevent the situation of having all the wrong answers come up. Like, you want to prevent that as much as possible, so you want your answers to be relatively wide reaching, to be able to interact with a lot of different sort of avenues and sort of strategies that opponents are looking at trying to force through. It's also interesting to sort of analyze the disruptive interaction and sort of think about like what they actually are wanting to interact with, because a lot of the time, like, you're going to be able to play actual factual counterspell in your deck, but maybe it's not efficient enough, and you do have to maybe go a bit more cheap and add on some restrictions to your interaction. So you really have to think about, if you do, or if you are making those trade-offs, what you're actually being disruptive toward. There are a lot of different requirements for if you want to interact with, say, a creature on the stack. Maybe you want to counter a Thassa's Oracle versus countering an Ad Nauseam. The cards that do both of those things tend to look very different.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's like one of the most like sort of important dynamics in CDH is certainly like counter spells that hit creatures. We've seen like huge variation in how playable they are, and like how valuable they are, and also from the side of people playing creatures, there's been big swings in like how strong is it to just have this effect on a creature, because they're typically much harder to deal with on the stack. And we've seen big swings in playability for cards like Grand Abolisher and Ranger Captain in particular.
Yep. Grand Abolisher is like the classic where it's a Grand Abolisher is a very, very powerful card when interaction suites are geared toward interacting with the stack and like interacting with the instance, and tends to become a lot less powerful and sort of just like a more expensive silence and a more color requirement silence when people are playing like literal counter spells or just things that interact with creatures well. There are like some pretty distinct categories, I'd say, though, like just going through in terms of like what disruptive interaction actually does work on. I think like the classic ones that you'll almost always see are things that disrupt instants and sorceries on the stack. These tend to be very cheap on rate. You like, obviously, again, Dispel, Flusterstorm, Swan Song, even Negate is like less color intensive than Counterspell, like literal Counterspell, which sort of gives you an idea of sort of the effective rates of that effect versus being able to counter creatures. And then in terms of being disruptive in interaction, period, you can also sort of evaluate whether or not you can wait to deal with a creature once it's in play using stuff like Swords to Plowshares, or if you need to handle a creature on the stack, and you need to use stuff like, again, Counterspell, Mana Drain, Voice of Will, to handle like potentially maybe a Thassa's Oracle or a Dockside on the stack where the removal isn't quite effective versus those. And then on the other side as well, looking at stuff that potentially interacts with non-creatures in play versus non-creatures on the stack, removal versus a negate, obviously, so something like a Nature's Claim versus, again, just stack interaction. Cool. So that I would say, if that's the primary way that we might delineate between interactive suites, or like maybe like interactive effects that you might be looking to include in your deck. There are a few other also like secondary splits and sort of delineations that you can draw, sort of lines in the sand, and also just ways of thinking about how you actually want to build your interaction suite. One that we have here is thinking about sort of like the prelude to you actually casting your interaction in a game of Magic. So sort of like, how are you setting up the situations where you're looking to make this this interaction valuable? So this is stuff like potentially, do you care about like maybe your own spell limiting? So if you're playing a bunch of rule of laws, maybe you don't want to just stock up on sorcery speed interaction. Maybe you want to be able to meter out your spells in other people's turns. If you're playing mana denial strategy, like maybe you want to look at, maybe even if you are a slow deck and slow decks traditionally are able to cast like 2 and 3 mana interactive spells, maybe you want to cut down on those and still stay lower to the floor on those. Stuff like if you're already planning on holding up mana on other people's turns, you might be able to afford certain types of interaction, like stuff like Narset's Reversal, where you wouldn't normally be able to play those because you might want to focus on effects that are also useful, just in general, when you're not like holding up mana already on other people's turns.
Yeah, and I think like it's also important to think about I guess this, or sorry, it's important to think about you know, your cards and what your other cards need to be doing. Particularly, obviously, free interaction is good.
Wow,
because it doesn't
crazy.
cost mana. I know, right? But a lot of free interaction costs additional cards. So you got like both forces, misdirection, you know, stuff like that. Where or you know, force of vigor.
Yep.
You know, there's a bunch of these effects.
Yeah.
That have seen, you know, some amounts of play, and you definitely need to be considering, can you support that amount of, like, you know, that damage to your hand,
And also,
that
like,
can
can
be
you
a
even
problem,
like cast
and obviously
them, right?
the color density
Yeah.
as well. Definitely a lot of decks tend to, you know, particularly like high color blue decks, like Kenrith Stax type builds, people tend to want to include Force of Will because it's obviously an incredibly powerful card. And then you look at the deck and you're like, oh, I'm playing like maybe 10 blue cards.
Yeah.
This might be a bit of a problem to try and support. And this is you know, something that you definitely need to be keeping in mind. In terms of casting your spells, particularly with the free ones, and also with the commander free ones, deflecting swat, fierce guardianship, and deadly relic. I've seen a lot of people put those in decks that probably don't cast their commanders that often.
Yeah,
and,
like you're playing like a 5 mana commander, and it's not even particularly integral to your game plan, and it's just not in play for half the games.
Yeah, and so those are definitely important things to sort of think about.
Yeah, 100%. There's also, I mean, actually getting into, it's sort of like something that you touched on earlier in that point about being able to support like actually like having the cards in hand to pitch. I'm sort of topping it of the order of what we have in our show notes here, but I think it's a really interesting tie-in of like sort of thinking about like how much interaction you're playing as well. Being that potentially if you're playing a deck that doesn't really have access to a lot of cards consistently, you don't have a card engine in the command zone, and but maybe you're not in black, so you can't really readily access like Rhystic Study, or you can't readily access some form of value engine that'll produce cards semi-reliably. You're gonna have a hard time going up like to higher numbers of counter magic and still having a functional deck, because a lot of the time you're just gonna be ending up playing these games where you have like half of a combo and you're trying to draw toward like literally any gas in your deck every draw step, and instead you're ripping counter spells and removal off the top, which is like really not what those decks need in those situations.
I definitely, I certainly, I think one of the biggest experiences with that for me was Kikar,
Yep.
where like the commander doesn't generate any card advantage, it generates mana advantage. And it's super easy in your head to be like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna be able to hold up mana because I'll have these, you know, tokens to sack and I can interact with everyone. And then you like draw hands that have, you know, some mana rocks, like maybe one card advantage spell and then some interaction, and you're going like, oh, well, I'm not actually like I can lose this game slowly, but you know, I can buy myself 2 turn cycles, and boy, I really hope one of the top 2 cards in my deck is good.
Just does like literally anything. Which is also that's sort of interesting as well, because I feel like especially evaluating like existing decks interaction suites, I feel like people a lot of the time tend to get hung up on like the decks like archetype, or sort of like the game plan in general, and just like sort of assuming that the entire, like, all of the selections in the interaction suite were made with that specific idea in mind. Where, like, a lot of the time, the actual delineation is, like, if you look at the difference between, like, Roxai and Blue Farm lists, those tend to be, like, I mean, obviously, Blue Farm's becoming more and more mid-range by the day, but Blue Farm could just sort of afford to play more random bits of interaction in the deck, and could sort of play, like, looser with its interaction package because it has two massive value engines in the command zone, and you just sort of see more cards every game, whereas, like, Roxai, just very reliant on its opening hand, cannot afford to dedicate that many slots to, like, more narrow interaction or interaction that reaches a bit outside of its, like, primary proactive game plan. Which is, like, not, like, you would expect potentially going in, looking at those two decks being like, okay, I mean, there's, like, one color of difference, so, like, maybe there's a Silence and a Swords in this 4-color deck, but, like, these have, like, relatively similar strategies. I would assume that the interaction suites are relatively similar. It's like, no, there's more going on behind the scenes there for selecting for what you want to play in those suites.
Yeah, I think that's an example that, like, solidifies it really well. I just, as you said that, I pulled up the two lists from the database, and, like, Force of Negation is not in the Rograk Silas primer that's on the database. And if you think about it, you might think, like, well, free interaction, it's super strong. The deck has a high enough density of blue cards to support it, but obviously it's a much more proactive deck than Tymna Kraum. You really just need to be going for it, and it doesn't work on your turn. You can't cast it for free to protect your own wins a lot of the time. Plus, like, the card advantage issues are very, very real in that deck, where if you, like, wait a turn and hold up interaction and then pitch 2 cards, like, that, it takes 2 turns to get those cards back. Because you just don't have any sort of consistent access to card advantage.
And then obviously, like, we're gonna get people yelling at us because we used specifically that that example, which is potentially gonna draw some ire. But obviously, like, there are, again, other reasons why these things are in place. Like, for example, Force Negation, not just because of what we talked about. There's also, Roxai expecting to be the fastest deck at the table a lot of the time doesn't necessarily really need the free interaction on specifically other people's turns. You typically run Force Negation if you're not expecting to be the absolute fastest deck at the table. But the arguments that we're laying out here, sort of the reasonings for why these things at least hold true, at least in part. There are definitely contributing factors here that have to do with the card advantage in the command zone, etc.
Well, I mean, so there is some truth to that. I will point out that the Roxai primer is on both Daze and Deadly Relic.
That is fair.
So it's going pretty deep on free interaction. So I wouldn't necessarily, like, just put it as simply as, because you're expecting to be the fastest deck at the table, you don't actually need to disrupt.
I was talking about, like, Force Negation specifically, right? In terms of, like, you're stopping other people from, like, getting ahead of you, versus, like, Daze and Relic can obviously be used on your own turn, during your winning turn.
Sure.
Again, and then we can go even further down that hole because people will come out of the woodwork and be like, well, no, because you could use Force Negation to counter, like, a Rule of Law or Deafening Silence on turn 1 and, like, stop yourself from being staxed out. Yes, I'm not going down that road. I'll cut it off here with the depth of this argument. It's literally everybody listening, plus Morgan listening to me right now, is literally just, like, listening to me have, like, a shower argument with myself and, like, trying to plan out. It's like doing the reverse of, like, revisiting an argument that you just had with somebody and, like, coming up with a comeback in the shower. It's just me sitting on a podcast trying to cover all the ways that people are gonna just be annoyed at us for these
how
examples.
About this? I'll throw you a bone. Instead of Force Negation, pretend I was talking about Snapback.
There you go. Perfect. Much more appreciated. Yeah, but so, again, sort of, like, getting back to the main topic here, sort of, like, in a similar manner, talking about the speed of decks, not necessarily maybe the card advantages in the command zone. There's also I would say a deeper discussion to be had on color requirements of interaction than is probably normally had on like just random Discord rambling arguments and Discord discussions about this kind of stuff, or like stuff on like I don't know, like stuff on Twitter about like interaction suites and stuff like that. Which is like obviously yes, blue is harder to cast than one blue. Blue is also more mana than a single blue. Yep, got all that. But there really is some interesting stuff here that sort of ties in with stuff that we've talked about before about figuring out what like lands you want to fetch on early turns, how you want to split your colors across your entire mana base when you have like a bunch of duels. You want to figure out what the correct balances are. Oh my, that took me like 3 attempts.
Correct balance is
balances. But the idea being that in your interaction suite, there is a very real consideration to be made a lot of the time that you probably actually, if you can afford to, and if you can find interaction that meets your like all your other criteria, you might want to look at your interaction suite or potential interaction suite, and then look at the rest of your deck and specifically the colors required to cast impactful cards that you will probably be wanting to protect, or potentially that you're developing at sorcery speed to then hold up disruptive countermagic on other people's turns, and try to figure out if you can build an interaction suite that's heavier on the colors that those like sorcery speed spells don't need to be used to cast. So potentially I'm playing maybe a Bant deck with just a ton of like blue sorcery speed stuff that I want to get into play. There's a bunch of stuff that looks like Heuristic Study, but is maybe worse. Like I'm playing like Verity Circle, or I'm playing like just like Steel Enchantment, just like a bunch of stuff that costs double blue that I want to cast at sorcery speed, or that like I want to cast during my my winning turn. In this,
remember
like
when people played Legacy's Allure?
God, dude. I actually I do, because I played that card. But just like if you're playing this hypothetical deck and you're building an interaction suite, even if you are more disruptive, or you're like slower and you want to be more disruptive to the rest of the table, a lot of the time, like you're probably actually going to be wanting to just integrate more stuff. Like maybe instead of Dispel in your deck, you're like actually just playing Veil or Autumn's Veil, because it's easier on your mana. You like maybe you're playing Dorks because you need the mana accelerant, and you just like have a bunch of extra green left over a lot of the time, and it's a lot easier to have your interaction cast for either white or blue when you're developing white or green rather, when you're developing things that cost blue at sorcery speed, or you want to be casting things that cost blue without waiting for other people to do their own thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, because I've certainly like fallen into the trap of, and it is like it can be difficult to split the difference.
Yeah.
Because,
like obviously you want to still be playing the good blue counter magic, right? Like obviously I'm still going to be playing like Force of Wills and stuff, but even past there, like this slow of a deck probably still wants to be on mana drain a lot of the time. You're still looking at like good card quality, but
yeah, no, but what I was gonna say is you want to split the difference on, like, you know, using the example of a Bant deck. Oftentimes on your turn, the spells you're going to be casting that you don't care about as much are green, right? Like you're just running out your extra dorks or whatever that, you know, there's like a lot of green creatures that typically just aren't interacted with that much. And so, you know, your thought naturally there is, oh, well, I'll play blue interaction. So, like, I spend my green mana on my turn casting elves, and then I hold up blue mana on my opponent's turn for counterspell. And that makes sense a lot of the time, but oftentimes, if your entire deck, if like all the cards that you actually really care about resolving and think people are going to stop you from trying to resolve are blue, then like maybe blue interaction isn't ideal there. I've definitely noticed, particularly playing Razaketh, or like Razakats and decks with Razaketh in it, where I'm like, I don't need that much black mana, and then like I'll hit that point of the game where I'm like, oh, this is a game where I'm casting Razaketh. And then all of a sudden it's like this big awkward, like I'll spend like 2 fetches in a row getting extra black mana, and like
you're
trying
like
to set
spinning,
up because I have 2
Thrasios trying to hit like a land, like a black land off the top to like get more sources in play.
And so like it is something worth keeping in mind. Um, and again, you do need that balance of, particularly on early turns, you want your interaction to not be the same color as the permanents you don't care about.
Yep.
But then on later turns, you want it to be not the same color as the permanents you do care about. And if those aren't the same color, it can be a little bit tricky to figure out exactly what you want to be doing. But I think Autumn's Veil is an excellent example of, honestly, a card that's like maybe a little underplayed in permanent based decks,
Yeah. No,
like
seriously.
particularly ones that are trying to develop that where their impactful permanents tend not to be green. Like you're
Yep.
trying to develop white stacks pieces. Autumn's Veil can be really, really nice.
Like honestly, like I don't know. I was about to make a statement out of the book. I gotta check the database list first. Yeah, like I gotta continue on. Like I didn't have to go do that. But like for something like Teamer Pirates, right? Like you like honestly, the Autumn's Veil could honestly be like just super super okay in that deck already, just because you're. It feels like a lot of the time you are playing like some of the mono green dorks. You are playing like the Llanowar elves, Elvish Mystic, Fainthorn elves a lot of the time in that deck. You might be fetching for like Tropical Island a lot of the time, and if you're trying to cast your Glenhorn Buccaneer for one red, obviously Malcolm helps out with that, but maybe you also want to be able to cast green interactive spells off of your dorks while doing that. Um. Anyway, that is a long way to say I agree. I think Autumn's Veil is actually pretty underplayed right now. I think the card's good. does a lot of work. But obviously, like we're talking about this in the context of dork stacks because this is a really easy thing to talk about, and like I feel like we both played a decent amount of Bant and have had like specifically that issue before of like, wow, I have a whole lot of green mana and like not much to do with it here. Like all of my impactful spells cost not green.
It's a
But this
curse.
is
It's an endless curse.
but this is also like super applicable even to like Grixis decks where it's like, okay, like I'm playing a lot of red rituals here. Maybe I want to actually just play both red blasts because I find that like I don't actually need to interact with other people that much, and I really need to stop them from countering my stuff. So I'm going to replace a couple of like blue counter spells that I've been playing, and instead of replacing them with the red blasts, just so I actually like have the colors to be able to interact with people consistently on my winning turns. Um, and then also like we're talking about stack interaction here. This also holds very much true with removal. So potentially I'm playing another hypothetical. I'm playing a bug deck. I like have a very similar issue with green. Like I have a lot of extra green. And then typically I want to be using blue for interaction a lot, and like black is technically is a lot of the time is going to be there for tutors and stuff. If I want removal in that deck, I a lot of the time I'm probably looking at even like double pip removal, like Assassin's Trophy and Abrupt Decay, over even like Chain of Vapor, just because it's so much easier to do impactful blue stuff and then also have the mana left over to be able to remove with green and black instead.
Yeah, it's definitely um some of these patterns get a little wonky as you get up there in colors,
Yeah,
and what you're actually looking for can sort of switch away from. I mean, we when we went over like the primary and to a certain extent the secondary thing, we were talking about good heuristics, right?
yeah,
Cheaper is better,
yeah,
broader is better. But then you can certainly run into a trap of just, oh, I'm putting in a whole bunch of things that actually are kind of awkward to cast, especially casting a whole bunch of interaction at once
yep.
when, I don't necessarily want to be fetching a lot of this all the time or like having this color. Um, and I mean, this is certainly where gold fishing can help a lot,
Yep, 100%.
in sorting out your colors. I think often interactive decks don't, like, you don't get a lot of information from goldfishing them, in terms of how they actually play out, but it can definitely help you sort out or identify potential mana base issues.
Yeah, that's like the one thing that you could do is like, okay, I'm just gonna like make land drops and cast spells while trying to hold up interaction. And if I can't both cast my spells and hold up interaction, there's a problem here, and we're gonna have to go like get to the root of this. Um, Also, as always, I mean, this is I'll say this now because this is like all pretty heavily tied with mana based stuff. If you're tuning an interactive suite, it gets a bit murkier. Like rather than like I have like this deck with like 20 slots left over, and I want to build an interaction suite and see if I have any slots left over to like just put in like fit in, cards that I just want to play. If you're refining or tuning an existing interaction suite, but also doing refining the rest of the deck in the process, this can all get sort of weird, and can sort of like end up with iffy results a lot of the time. If you're like, oh, I'm gonna like tune my, like I'm having a hard time casting all these interactive spells at the same time that I'm winning the game, I'm gonna like tune my interaction suite, and then also like I'm making some mana based changes for unrelated reasons or semi-related reasons, and then you end up like back in the same spot because you made changes in like opposing directions that you didn't really initially see. So that is all to say, when we're talking about the effects of the rest of the deck on building out your interaction suite, and not just sort of your abstract wants, you should probably be doing this stuff like one thing at a time. So build out your interaction suite, test the interaction suite, see how that goes, and then if you're also making other changes, like hold off on evaluating those until like you've like fixed like one portion of your deck at a time.
No, just do everything all at once and just make like conflicting changes. Just put in a card, put in mana that lets you cast the card that you're cutting.
Yep. All right, we're gonna cut all these dorks and then put in a cradle, and we're just gonna like load up on just like green artifact enchantment removal as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, so unless you have anything else to talk about color requirements, because I know you love talking about mana and colors, as do I, but I think you have a special appreciation in your heart for that one.
Yeah, it's just something that like I think this is where just like playing a lot of games is, and noticing something like that, you start to realize like, it's an opportunity to make either a good or bad decision that most of the time isn't relevant, and then every once in a while it definitely pays off. And it starts with building your deck, and then it happens when playing your deck as well.
Exactly. So next up on the sheet here, I wrote this one out, but I'm sure you probably have stuff to say about this too, is considering, so once you have like a basic interaction suite built out that like sort of fulfills your, again, abstract wants and your needs for an interactive suite, and you're like pretty confident in it, before you go running into a game with that, with all that interaction and all that new shiny counter magic, I would say consider this as well. Is your deck already mitigating some of the reasons why you would want that interaction? Maybe you haven't played like any games with this deck yet, or any games with this package, with this strategy maybe, and you're just sort of like building out an interaction suite with it. Maybe you don't actually need all of that interaction or a certain class of the interaction that you're playing that much, because of some of the stuff the rest of your deck is doing. A big one like this is if you're already playing a bunch of Stax pieces in your deck, maybe there are certain parts of your interaction package that like really just aren't needed as much, because the Stax already carries a lot of that torch, or carries a lot of that load. This would be stuff like if you're playing things like a bunch of tax effects, it might be worth it to just like sort of shave back on counter magic, not just because you're less able to cast it because you're playing tax effects, but also like it's gonna cost your opponents more to do more stuff in the same turn. So like maybe you don't need that Flusterstorm as much if you're playing a bunch of tax effects and Rule of Law, because you're sort of covering that axis already, and you just sort of have a bit of anti synergy, or it's just not really that like required. A big one as well for this is maybe your strategy doesn't actually care about what your interaction is built to interact with. Maybe you're playing just like a ton of permanent based removal, or sorry, like permanent targeting removal. You're just playing like a bunch of disenchants, a Beseiju, Otawara, Nature's Claim, Sas's Trophy, Abrupt Decay, and just like actual factual disenchant, Force of Fate, etc., etc., etc. That might not actually be that great if you're maybe just like playing a deck that already bypasses a bunch of the stacks that you might already be worried about. Like you're worried about like, oh man, these rule of laws could be really tough, and it's like, well, like does your deck operate through rule of laws pretty well? Do you actually want it gone? Maybe you shave down on the interaction a bit there on that axis.
Yeah, definitely. I think this was like a big thing where, Nature's Claim was like you know, a very much a staple for a really long time, and then people started like experimenting. Oh, I'll put in Force of Vigor, because it hits two things and it's free and it's great. And then when Boseiju came out, I definitely started realizing it's like, okay, there aren't. I don't know if I have the targets to justify all three of these.
Yep.
Sometimes it's only two. Sometimes it's even just one, depending on if you're playing. Like if you're in black and then you also have your trophy and your decay, then maybe you really only need one of them. And I think that's, sort of an interesting thing to look at in terms of, like, yeah, how often do I actually need to remove the things that I'm going after? And, I mean, there are some decks where legitimately the most threatening card, or like permanent, the most threatening long-term permanent an opponent could play is a Heuristic Study.
Yep.
And just, yeah, having a bunch of ways to deal with that can be very strong. And maybe you don't need as many ways to deal with creatures if you're, if your deck just isn't really threatened by a lot of creature matchups. I mean, maybe you do, because a lot of the creatures that are threatening kind of need everyone to be able to deal with them.
Yeah. But like maybe you're like you already have removal in the command zone, right? Maybe you're playing like a Halana deck, and it's just like you need to take that into account when you're building an interaction suite for that kind of deck, where it's like, yeah, like I already have like baked in removal in the command zone. Same thing with Armix, right? Like I have baked in removal in the command zone. Maybe I could just like go a bunch lower on the targeted removal here and just sort of like lean on my commanders a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. No, I was just saying, like, with creatures, more than other decks, like if you don't care about rule of law, you don't need to remove it. If you can like always block things that attack you and you're not concerned about your life total, that doesn't mean you can ignore a Grim Hireling, right?
Sure.
Like,
yeah. Or a Winota or a Nagila, etc., etc. Yeah. And then also like there are always like other mitigating factors for actual requirements here as well. Even just like, again, like maybe you just like don't this is a very toxic way of thinking about it, and I don't encourage people to build decks like this, but there's a lot of decks that are like this. Maybe you're playing a deck in colors that can support a bunch of interaction, but your strategy, you just like really don't want to be tied down to like being table police like ever, and like don't want to have to like actually interact with people. And maybe the deck's just like built in such a way that when you make win attempts, you make one, and then the next turn after that you make another one, and the turn after that you can just keep making win attempts forever. Yeah, I mean, maybe depending on your personal playstyle, you can just start trimming out interaction there as well. Just you sort of rely on the deck to do its thing more, and you just sort of want to make space in the deck for maybe more explosiveness or just more consistency on those win attempts.
My life playing with Reed.
Yeah, I mean that's a honestly fair criticism. I feel like I'm better now. I tend to play table police more. It's a change of the times, man. You can't convince people to just like put mana drain and counterspell a Dovin's Veto in their deck anymore. Speaking of, actually, I think Dovin's Veto is actually a pretty interesting one to talk about right now, because it is. I feel like it's seen a fair amount of play over the years that it's been out. Obviously, much less recently. I think mana is at probably more of a premium than ever in terms of evaluating interaction suites right now. But it's a weird one to evaluate, and I think people got Veto wrong a lot in terms of like what decks it should have gone in.
Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. I think it's also like I think it was a weird one because like the reasons it's good, or like the reason you might say it's not good, isn't like because people misevaluated, like, the most obvious reason you would think that it's not good is just, oh, it's hard to cast, like it's 2 mana, 2 different colors.
Yeah.
And like that's actually not at all why it's not good, and it has a lot more to do with just how much stuff it doesn't stop, and how
Yeah.
how much less valuable an
This spell can't be
uncounterable
countered.
counterspell has become
Yep.
over time
Yep.
with the printing and popularity of, like, obviously
SWAT,
both
Veils.
Veil of Summer and
Yep.
Deflecting Swap were printed after it was, but both Misdirection and Mindbreak Trap see a lot more play than they used
Yep.
to. And Ranger Captain, Grand Abolisher, like all of these things, Dovin's Veto lines up pretty poorly against. So I think people like got it wrong, not in that they thought they could cast it and they couldn't, but more in that they thought it was way more effective than it was.
Yeah. And honestly, also there's like a whole like sub game to Veto as well, in terms of I like, people were obviously playing it in like primarily disrupt, like decks that wanted to be disruptive with their interaction packages, like stopping people from winning and such. There was a time when people were like playing a decent amount of it, even in decks that were like relatively proactive, want to win the game relatively easily, relatively quickly, consistently. And a lot of the time, actually, in those decks, depending on how you sequence things, the veto can actually be a bit of a liability, because a lot of the time in those decks, you sort of want to like draw interaction out of the rest of the table, and just having like a hard stop and that like potentially being your only interaction could get pretty awkward in those situations, just because you're like, well, like, it's sort of on me to stop this, but I can't really like bait the person that's going for a win here to like throw stuff back at me and like try to get more interaction out of their hand, because this is just sort of like a hard no, and there's just like no maneuvering around it with traditional counter magic, unless you also have like a SWAT or a Veil.
Although it does also have some strengths in particularly decks that their threats are, hard to counter, read creatures.
Yep.
Because, sometimes you have like your creature-based win con in hand, and you go like, there's probably, not a counterspell that hits creatures, because there just aren't that many of those that see a lot of play. It's like Force of Will, some decks play Mana Drain, occasionally you'll see like a Delay or an Arcane Denial, and then I guess Mindbreak Trap.
Yeah, are the big ones.
so like Dovin's Veto can be really nice because, if the table has one Force of Will and then like a Dispel and a Flusterstorm and a Swan Song, you can force a creature through with just the Dovin's Veto, because there's only one counterspell that actually hits the thing you're trying to resolve. But it doesn't work. It's not any better than a negate when you're trying to protect an ad nauseum.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Or like almost never. Right? Yeah, I guess it can't be blasted, but
but like it's super
like you go,
narrow.
Cast ad nauseum. They counter it. I'll protect it with Dovin's Veto. They go, cool. I'll counter your ad nauseum again. Like, so as a protective piece of interaction, it only works. It only works when the thing that you're protecting is much harder to counter than a different counter spell would have been. But it can be effective in that scenario.
Yeah, definitely. That being said, I started a discussion about Dylan's Veto because I thought the card was interesting. This is probably the episode to do so. Let it be known that we could probably have a similar discussion to this one, and there's probably a similar amount of nuance to like most counterspells that see play in CDH right now, outside of like, I don't know, like stuff like the staples that nobody is ever cutting right now, like Mental Misstep and Force and such. But yeah, I mean, I guess the other one, I guess the other class that we could talk about in terms of like discussing them individually would probably be like Offer and Arcane Denial. I know Lyndon's gonna have an aneurysm that we talked about Arcane Denial at all.
I don't think we could talk about Arcane Denial
no?
without Lyndon here.
All right, sure. We'll talk about Offer then. It's a decent stand-in, I'd say. Offer is also an interesting one, huh? Because it's I think it does deserve some special comment, especially on the interaction episode, / counter magic episode, where it's the it feels like the downsides and sort of the incentives on it are a lot harder to read. At least like for somebody just like looking at a general set of CDH lists, it's like it feels like it would be difficult to come up with a reason why you would and why you wouldn't play it in even lists that like look relatively similar. It is actually sort of interesting, right? That like I think probably the first place that a lot of people's minds would go is like, oh yeah, like if you're playing oofs and like null rods, you could probably play offer you can't refuse for free. Which I mean, like, there's some truth to that. But also like there's just the value of giving your opponent treasures is very, very fluid depending on what deck you're playing, what deck they're playing, what stage of the game you're in, what like specific situation in that stage of the game that you're in. I don't know. I'm just thinking like maybe we can give our valued listeners some frameworks to evaluate it on because it is interesting in my opinion. I think probably the biggest one would be like are you using it to protect your own stuff or disrupt other people's stuff? Because obviously having a 1 mana counterspell that can counterspell anything that's not a creature is pretty unparalleled in the sort of range for mana cost value or mana cost in general. But the downside is pretty huge. I think a lot more often than people would like to think.
Yeah, it's definitely like a very tough one, and I think like I interestingly like I think I kind of got it. It's like I got it right for the wrong reasons and wrong for the right reasons a little bit.
Sure.
I think like obviously there's a huge amount of hype for the card when it was spoiled. I've seen like a few people recently who I would have expected to like the card, sort of talking down about it a bit. And it's interesting. I've just you know, like every time that card has been played against me, I haven't been unhappy.
Yeah. Yep.
And that like makes me not want to play it as much. But obviously like it is an extremely flexible card. And like Swan Song has been a staple forever. And it's it's more broad than Swan Song. Admittedly not like a lot more broad.
Yeah, not much more. I mean, we handle artifacts as an add-on, which is I don't know, like
and the very rare planeswalker. But,
yeah, that's true.
But I think like it definitely suffers a lot as protective interaction, because often when you're picking your window for something that's going to require protective interaction, your goal is to your goal is to, instead of running your opponents out of cards, you're trying to run them out of mana, right? Like,
yeah,
somebody taps low to cast something, somebody interacts before your turn, and then it's like, oh wow, there's only 2 or 3 mana from the rest of the table, so now's my window.
Yeah, we're gonna
and countering the first counterspell from someone with an offer you can't refuse often just lets them play their second one.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like, I think people who have used it that way have definitely soured on it a little bit, at least on that front.
Yeah.
And so it's a card that I could certainly see, metas where it's fantastic and decks that absolutely want it. But also it has a lot of liabilities that aren't necessarily the most obvious at first blush.
Yeah, face value. I think a big one as well is that it's sort of like valuable if the things that you're targeting are like if you're very consistently targeting things that are likely to be the only version of that effect in that opponent's hand at any given point in time, and that you care so much about that you don't really care about giving them the extra mana for. So like using like 1 mana to counter a rule of law being cast, or 1 mana to cast, or 1 mana to counter Like just some massive value engine. 1 mana to counter a Rhystic Study is really important a lot of the time, where it's like, yeah, you could have the 2 mana because you're casting this Rhystic Study because you don't have cards in hand. Or like, like countering a Naz, right? You're like, okay, like get the Naz out of here. You can have the mana back, sure, but like it's off the table, and I had enough flexibility to be able to handle like something else potentially as well, right?
Yeah, it's one that can definitely be tricky to use. And like I will say though, I have seen more times than honestly I would have expected. It just giving the mana for somebody to attempt something else like equally bad or comparably bad. I've definitely had it happen that someone goes like, cool, I'll cast, this, like I'll make this sort of win attempt. And then they get offered and then they go, cool, I'll slam this breach or I'll slam like a wheel or something like that.
Were you in the game when I was playing where
you got double offered?
I went for, I forgot what I was going for, but I think I was going for a power play that wasn't necessarily going to lead to a win, but I was like not really like wanting to let it get countered, so I got offered twice in the same turn, and which there was an oof on the board, so it made a lot more sense where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, like we'll just like give you the treasures, these aren't really worth anything, so get offered twice, and then I looked at my hand and looked at the board and was like, oh, cool. The fact they offered me twice means that I can spend this 1 mana removal spell to get rid of the oof, and then I've Dark Ritualed off of trying to make a win attempt, and then I'm just gonna kill you anyway. But anyway, I think people, I think more than enough has been said about the downsides of offer, and I will say, I'm still not a particularly huge fan of it in a majority of lists, honestly, at this point, but it's an interesting one to evaluate, and I think it's worth singling out and talking about, because it's one of those ones that I think there are a few pieces of interaction in a lot of removal suites out there that are sort of hard to evaluate with just the stuff that we've gone over so far. I think like maybe one more of those, even though it's seeing less play now, and certainly never saw a whole lot of play, is Narset's Reversal. You can also group this one in with like Reband, but a lot of the time you'll see Reband being played less in decks that actually just want to counterspell, and more like Kark Sakashima or things that are like more using it because they're either discounting the cost or they're like casting a bunch of them and like be able to profit off of them.
Honestly, I thought you were just gonna say often you're gonna see Remand being played less and then just stop there.
Honestly, yeah, not a bad observation. But yeah, so Narset's Reversal is actually a really interesting one as well. I've found that like really powerful effect, right? I'm gonna spend 2 mana to tax your DT by like another 1 and a black, and also I get a DT. Or I'm gonna copy your Naz and you dumped your entire hand trying to get up to 5 mana to cast Naz, and I'm taking your Naz now, and you can have it back, and you're left like 2 lands and nothing in play. And I'm Nazing. So like really powerful effect, but it's sort of interesting the incentives that it gives you, right? Where a lot of the time, because it's so narrow, like it's basically a dispel for blue in the disruptive case. Like writing off, like assume that your Narset's Reversal is getting countered when you're casting it, and you're just sort of feeding it into a counter spell war. It's like a blue dispel, right? Which like not a great rate. You could definitely do a lot better than that. Not being able to hit creatures sort of sucks in comparison to counterspell and mana drain. Just like having some issues with like hitting even like stuff like Rhystic Study. But the fact that if you do manage to resolve it on something, it can be very powerful, sort of like leads to this interesting case with it where you're just more likely to play it in decks where it's already supported by a bunch of counter spells and counter magic that can cover the cases that it's not really super effective at, and where you're already holding up mana for other people's turns, because it gives you just a lot more of an incentive to like hold up mana, and then like if you actually need to handle something, you can spend your cheap interaction. But if somebody just fires off a tutor, you can just sort of Narset's Reversal it and then use their tutor as your own at instant speed. I'm not actually. Can you think of any other counterspells that have sort of like similar incentives right now? Because I can't really come up with anything.
I mean, I guess like the only it's even less of a counterspell than Narset's Reversal, but Dual Caster Mage definitely can have
sure, yeah, honestly
similar play patterns there.
And you know what? That's actually not even. I wouldn't even say that's a bad example either, because we have historically seen, especially in stuff like Mono Red, or even is it, honestly. People playing like twin casts. I mean, not actual twin cast. What forks? There we go. Um, but people just like playing fork because being able to basically have like red counterspell in a counterspell war is like not particularly inefficient, and then also being able to like double up on other people's tutors as well again, or like value plays is a pretty nice upside. So you know what, let's expand the Narsets reversal discussion out to like all like forks, dual caster mage and fork and twin cast and all that stuff. It's sort of an interesting category, just because, yeah, it's like the incentive is that either you're playing it in decks that don't have access to actual counter magic, or decks that have a lot of counter magic already and are just sort of like looking for additional things to do at instant speed, but like not really in between.
It also, like, the various different versions of these effects can line up slightly oddly against things that aren't literal counterspells.
Right.
Like, obviously, you know, if people are removing, like, you're casting your mono red combo, whatever it is, and you have a fork, and then someone goes, cool, I'll Assassin's Trophy your one of your combo pieces.
Yeah.
Well, you know, fork's not great. It's one of the few like pieces of instant speed interaction that is unironically excellent against silence.
Oh, fantastic! Oh my god.
Like, arguably way better than just a counterspell.
Yep.
But it does nothing against Veil of Summer, which is kind of odd because typically
like, you would think they would expect relatively similar effects, but
yeah. But they're very much not. So, or they're very much not with how they're interacted with copies. So yeah, it's a really, like, it can be a really weird space to get into. I think it's also, effects like that are very tricky to play, because you know, like, it's hard to decide when you have a Narsets reversal. It can be hard to decide, you know, do I want to just cash this in for like a tutor that's on the stack? Do I want to hold it? Do I want to, like, give somebody the opportunity to sort of 2-for-1? Like, it can be really risky to, you know, someone casts an important spell, and you have like first priority, and you're looking at your Narsets reversal, and you go, well, if I cast this and it gets countered, then, or like, and the original spell gets countered,
I'm just a card and 2 mana down for nothing. Yeah.
But obviously the ceiling on it is just so insanely high. Like, nothing is better than forking, if you can time it right, forking the spell that's already getting countered.
Yep. Somebody fires off a counter.
You get it and they don't.
And at that you're just like, yes, yoink, thank you.
So it's they're very much high risk, high reward cards to play.
Yep, definitely. And again, interesting incentives. I would actually like to see more low color red decks start considering the forks again, because I think they're actually like, I think the right metas, they're actually like very powerful a large percentage of the time, and the fact that you can like cast them off of red rituals is pretty neat, pretty hot. Especially for like protecting your own win attempts. And I think that one actually dovetails in with, I think, probably the last like major point that we're gonna get into, which we sort of touched on a bit earlier, but I did want to get through it fully. Which is something that Morgan wrote down here, which is just sort of talking about what kind of interaction density you can actually support in your deck. And specifically, I was looking at this one to get dovetailed in nicely with, you know, Narsets Reversal being a card that you want to play in a deck with a bunch of counterspells that's already in it, which is how easy it is to actually like hold up the mana to cast your interaction. Because we sort of talked about it, we talked around this one a bit, but we haven't really like dug into it. You want to like sort of go ahead with what you had as primary points here?
Yeah, so I think on the first point in terms of density and what you can support, you know, obviously you need space for your other cards in the deck. and you need to be figuring out, okay, what is my deck actually uh like what is my deck actually doing to see more cards, because if I have this really high density of interaction, um does that mean that I just often won't have enough gas? And if I don't have card advantage in the command zone, or consistent access to card advantage engines, um, you can definitely get yourself in a rut where you just keep falling farther behind to avoid losing. Like this would be something like the Kikar example,
Yep.
where it was a very interactive deck. People knew that. They'd like let me interact with stuff. And then if I didn't develop a good engine, I would just be slowly digging myself into a bigger and bigger hole over time. Um and this is I think a very common thing as people explore like alternate commander options in the same color combination. I think is like a really important. It's important to understand when you can and can't just like copy paste an interaction suite with a commander swap.
Yep.
And so that was sort of what I meant in terms of having the gas you need. And then the other thing is in terms of playing it, like what is your deck trying to do? When is your deck casting permanence? When is it developing its engines? You can have a deck that like can starting on turn 4, say, you'll have like a very established board state and you can afford to hold interaction and you'll have engines and it'll be great. But what about the turns before that? If your deck is and so like you might think in a deck like that, oh well, I'll play like good interaction, the more expensive but more flexible, more powerful interaction, load me up on my mana drains and counter spells and all of that stuff. But then you also need to realize, you
have to
if
get
I'm
there.
like if I'm like always trying to curve, if I'm always trying to curve like Dork into Timna into whatever, oftentimes I'm gonna just die if I'm like tapping out on turn 3 and all my interaction is stuff like mana drain and not stuff like like maybe mind break trap or going deeper, force negation, misdirection, stuff like that. And so you do need to be cognizant of what interaction is good at what stages of the game and when you can support what kind of interaction, and making sure that those line up relatively well.
Yeah, definitely.
And sort of under that in the opposite direction, rather than expensive interaction is weaker early. Often I see people putting counter spells that are pretty soft in decks that are going very late. Like counter and like a spell pierce on turn
miscast.
7
Yeah.
is oh boy, is it not where you want to be.
That's the number of times that I've seen people pay for spell pierces with their like Priest of Titania that taps for like, again, like 5 on turn 8 or whatever. It's just like, yeah, that's not where this one's intended to be used.
Yeah. And like even to a certain extent, what's it called? Delay in like really slow decks.
Yep.
Like when someone casts something that was delayed, boy is it a bad feeling.
Yep. It's like, oh right, that Seaboard Beast is coming back down. Huh. Right. And nobody found the actual counterspell for it? Great, okay.
Yeah, so you just need to make sure that like if you're taking the game late, your interaction is built to accommodate that fact, but also particularly if you're going to be tapping out a lot early, then there are certain sacrifices you need to make in that department as well. And I guess I would also say, obviously, that's not exactly part of the topic, but if you are trying to develop stuff, like we talked a little bit about, does your interaction hit stuff that's already sort of covered by the stacks you're playing? If you feel like you do need to be developing permanence, it can be worth it to throw in some of the softer stacks to sort of alleviate that. Like if you don't want to stuff your deck full of card disadvantage or like situational counter spells, but you do need to be developing a board state of some kind. You can sometimes look to permanence to shore up those weaknesses.
Yep, definitely. Cool. Oh, actually, just something came to me just recently that I did want to get through because it's less relevant now, but it's still something to be aware of. As just also considering your interaction package as part of your win condition. This is a big one that I've seen like so many people run into of just like I'm playing a deck that makes infinite mana and draws its deck, and then sometimes maybe I'm also like playing consults and stuff. I just like don't have access to my primary win conditions. I don't have my Thoracle anymore, or I just am not playing a Thoracle, and I'm just trying to kill with stuff that is just in my deck as is. Maybe I'm playing like a lightning bolt as my primary win condition, but I got exiled earlier in the game. Just like having the consideration of having at least parts of your interaction package being cards that can win you the game if you just loop them over and over and over again. Obviously, Bolt is a pretty common one in red infinite mana decks that you'll see because the rate's not bad. I mean, obviously, it's fucking lightning bolt. Come on, rate's pretty good. Less great in CDH, but still, and it can actually kill people. But you also see stuff like this with particularly Winds of shit, not Winds of Abandon. Sorry, Winds of Abandon is infected my mind. I hate it. It's all I can think of it anymore. No, but Winds of Rebuke is like the classic in this one. I guess the even more classic would be Reality Shift, just to exile people's decks. But just considering like, hey, if I'm playing a deck that tends to make infinite mana and draw, and then I need to like actually end the game somehow, just looking at your interactive package to see if you can fit some additional things in that'll actually let you end the game on the spot if you need to, and also like aren't like terrible things to be casting in a game of CDH. Cool.
Are we doing the return to WinCon list? Is that the?
Oh god, dude, honestly, I'm sort of happy that we're just like most decks in the format are just like off of Twister loops and off of infinite mana stuff at this point because it just saves so much explaining. It's okay. So win con list doesn't actually mean win con list. It means that you're playing a win con, but it means that the things that are outletting your win con aren't actually like things that are dedicated in those slots to outletting the win con. And then also you have to explain anyway. You have to explain fucking Twister loops to people who have only played standard cards.
Man, that's why I was playtesting a deck the other day and realized I had to do a culling the weak endurance loop.
Oh yeah, that endurance has made some Twister loops just absolutely cursed because of the stuff that you have to do with it to get it to loop. Just like, okay, either I can loop equal to the number of green cards in my deck -1, or I need things that can sack an endurance.
Or like I've definitely had to set up where I was like abrupt decaying my endurance.
Yeah,
this
sucks.
Is
terrible. Actually, endurance is a fun one to talk about as well. I'm not going to drag this episode out for too much longer, but endurance, I will say, is a card that I think exemplifies a couple of things that we've talked about in this episode so far in terms of like both splitting your mana production, so it being like a green interactive spell for other people's win attempts is actually pretty great, especially when you're hard casting it. And then also like prioritizing, the cheapness of being able to cast it for free is very much a large part of its power and sort of the evaluation of playing it as a card. And then also it also shows you that you also can't just like not pay attention to the rest of what a card does, even if you're only caring about one effect, because holy moly is endurance a great attacker and a pretty good blocker.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes a 3/4 with reach, real good.
Yep. Just not bad on its own. Have munched many a Timna with an endurance.
Dude, I hate it because now I have to be paranoid.
Yep, they're holding up a bunch of green mana with one card in hand. Well, I guess we'll make this attack. Honestly, life's hard for the Timna pilots. I gotta say it. I'll say it. so
Is
much,
that
so
is
much
that the
mental
take?
load.
I'm not sure that's the
there's
take.
there's just so much mental load. It's just God, Tim is just such a fucking hard card to play correctly, man. It's just the skill level is unreasonably high on that one. It's just it's unreal. Tim and Piles don't get the respect they deserve. For legal purposes, that was all a joke, and all like also for intensive purposes, because like I please don't get in my DMs about Timna. I know it's a busted card, no skill required.
I'm gonna DM you about Timna.
Just right now. Yeah. All right. I think that's good. I think we're chugging out of steam on that one, at least for the lines of thinking that we had there. We could probably talk about interaction forever, but I'm not going to belabor our listeners with a 3-hour podcast where we literally talk about every single piece of interaction, the format in depth. So I think we'll cut it off there for the main topic. And then in terms of everybody's favorite section of the podcast, I'll give it a quick gut check. We, again, are not doing gut checks for the most part for a 2-person podcast right now. It's just not particularly interesting. Although, rest assured, when we have Lyndon back and when we have guests on, we will 100% still be running gut checks on those episodes. So keep your eye out. We will be posting those in the Discord. And if you're listening to this as your first episode, or you've never visited our Discord before, you might want to go check out there anyway, because we have a bunch of all of our historical gut checks in a channel on the Discord, and you can go vote and see what everybody thought about them. So go do that. We also have an empty space here for our listener questions. We try to get to a listener question every episode for non-special episodes. We don't have one for this episode, but if you'd like to submit one, you're more than happy to. Also in our Discord, we have a listener question submissions channel that you can go submit questions that you'd like to have answered on the podcast too, and we'll try our best to get through them. For our patrons, we also have a listener question submission channel in our patron section, which actually has priority over everybody else. So if you're a patron and would like your question answered, we will prioritize yours above the general public's for a general public. But if you would like a question answered particularly timely or in a timely manner, you're more than welcome to throw a couple of bucks our way and come join the Discord and throw some questions in there. We also have a channel for topic suggestions as well for patrons. So if you've ever wanted to have an entire episode done on a certain topic, we can't guarantee that we'll cover all of those, but we'll certainly take them into account when we're scrambling pre-episode to try to put show notes together. As Morgan can confirm.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Anyway, that one, in that case, because those are the two things that we usually do after our main episode, we'll about wrap it up for this episode. If anybody would like to reach out to us with questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at IntoTheNorthPod, via our email at IntoTheNorthPodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks goes to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work toward improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we're at patreon.com/IntoTheNorthPodcast. It's also in the description for this episode. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, if you use our affiliate link, which is also in the description, a portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. The next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then.